In every church in Christendom, we'll eventually be confronted with some great personal offenses.
How can we handle major conflict?
Is conflict resolution possible or realistic?
What can we do when our grievances are ignored?
Why is conflict a part of life?
Let's look at Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20, and learn some broad principles of working through great personal offenses. Let's remember that the setting in Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20, is a time when the disciples were the church. After the resurrection, the house church became the norm. Mega-churches, such as the Assembly on Pentecost, were and still are rare exceptions. So taking most disputes to the whole church is not literally possible in larger assemblies. But the spirit of these instructions is applicable in many wonderful ways. Conflict will always be a part of church life, as long as sin exists. Sometimes we can resolve things easily, and sometimes we must separate for a time, like Barnabas and Paul, or the universal church and our schisms through Christian history. In Matthew 18:15, Jesus taught, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone." The wording softened in most English translations. The sense in the original language is much stronger, such as to convict him of his fault. Today we might say if you've got to berate someone, do so privately rather than castigate them in public. It's the kind of thing we might try to do behind closed doors. It's not talking about everyday personality conflicts. In those cases, we bear with one another. In this case, the offense is personal and major. Most of the time, we forbear one another's weaknesses. It's no use creating an argument over every minor infraction. Some churches may have such an intolerably authoritarian atmosphere of fear, but that's not how knowledgeable Bible students know how church should be. Forgiveness and forbearance of each other's faults makes a church more enjoyable. But does that mean that we should never say anything? There is a legitimate time to speak. And Jesus seems to indicate that when a sin is directed at us personally, then we may cautiously act. In fact, Jesus recommends going to our brother alone over a personal offense. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. In Matthew 18:16, we read that after talking to someone privately about a personal offense, if he will not hear you, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. The principle of 2 or 3 witnesses is Jesus' recognition of a legal obligation in the Old Testament. This step escalates the situation way beyond a simple personal offense. The purpose of these extra friends, or perhaps even people familiar with the situation, is probably to convince a person of their fault, and even to witness their response of willingness or unwillingness to change. What kinds of offenses deserve to be taken to the next level? Personal offenses may range from a simple misunderstanding to gross sins like being swindled or defamation of character. When Jesus said, "If he will not hear, take with you one or two more," that's not encouragement to escalate every single dispute. This is a principle, not something to apply literally every time someone disagrees with us. Mostly, we simply forgive and forget when our friends cannot understand what they've done. The offense is not worth taking any further. Most often, we decide to agree to disagree and part as friends. We only escalate really bad situations. Jesus explained the ultimate escalation of a dispute between 2 church members. This is the final stage of a 3-stage process in major disputes. 1. Go to them alone. 2. Take 2 or 3 witnesses. 3. If he refuses to hear them, take it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, Let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. So we take the dispute to the community of believers. Here, there's yet no concept of individual congregations, nor a hierarchy of church elders. There's only a diverse group of disciples, a few, a dozen, 100, and rarely thousands. What disputes would we call a church assembly to decide? What offenses would we escalate up through church hierarchy? Jesus concludes teaching about conflicts in Matthew 18:17 that if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. What does that mean? Does it mean excommunication in some cases? Does it mean that we simply continue to welcome someone while praying for the day that they repent? Does it mean a public realization that their conversion is perhaps not a reality? Should we shun such people, or simply treat them as kindly as we do all our other non-Christian neighbors? In Matthew 18:18, we read, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The footnote says, "will have been bound, will have been loosed." In the context of handling disputes, this expands the promise given Peter to all the apostles, and by extension to the whole Christian community. The church community's decision to excommunicate, absolve of guilt, or simply forbear are inspired by heaven. The antecedent to this are the poskim of Jewish tradition, whose binding and loosing was halakha, written and oral law. Jesus often criticized their traditions. What Christian traditions are inspired by heaven? Does Jesus' statement to the apostles in Matthew 18, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven," mean that all formal or ex cathedra dogmas are infallible? The Christian community is in remarkable consensus on Jesus' teachings, but not in everything. Jesus' instruction was in the context of dealing with serious personal offenses. When do offenses require a decision by the broader church? What issues are personally offensive to you? Are we quiet for the sake of peace, or is our cause too important for peace? Each of us must pick our battles carefully. Should we also listen more carefully when the broader Christian community agrees on a matter? In Matthew 18:19 and 20, Jesus said that, "If two of you agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it'll be done for them by my Father in heaven." He also added that, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I'm there in the midst of them." Does that mean that God's obligated to answer a prayer agreed to by at least 2 Christians? What if we have 2 Catholics, 2 Orthodox, and 2 Protestants praying contradictory prayers? What does the context of Jesus' remark tell us? It's talking about solving offenses in the church and God's blessing on the witnesses in such a dispute. Matthew 18:19 and 20 is often misused to support exaggerated views of spiritual warfare, group prayer, or husbands and wives praying together. The difference between a mature and immature Christian church is not an absence of conflict, but how it's handled. Jesus gives us 3 broad principles of conflict resolution, coupled with prayer for wisdom from heaven. This can go a long way to working through some very sticky interpersonal situations. It may not be a successful formula in situations outside the church, where prayer may not be a factor. However, among brothers and sisters who are anxious to live together in harmony, it can be very helpful in solving many conflicts. The spirit of these verses can apply to a wide variety of conflicts, from a simple personal offense to ecclesiastical decisions affecting the whole church. Not every private confrontation will produce a happy ending, and not every ecclesiastical decision will have universal acceptance. However, we're called to live in peace with one another. Sometimes, like Barnabas and Paul, like Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, the reality is that we'll separate for a time, but our goal of eventual reconciliation remains.